Everybody loses in this story, even the man who gets the girl. She loses her freedom the moment she falls for the wrong monster. Her brother loses everything trying to protect her. He loses the right to call what he feels love the second suspicion enters the room. Because this isn't just a mafia romance, it's a rigged emotional chess game where every move hurts someone. He saves her, proposes, touches her belly like he finally found peace. And then one envelope blows the whole thing apart. The hero may have been the one who set the fire.
Here, the subject's narrative fractures. She actively suppressed traumatic data, the inciting incident, the resulting emotional distress, and the subsequent pregnancy. Alessia initiated a flight response, attempting to erase her existence from his sphere of influence. He countered with a classic, predatory containment strategy, his verbalization a simple assertion of control. "You're not going anywhere." This was followed by a declaration of ownership. "This baby is mine." Her autonomy was systematically nullified. Case file, Alessia, onset of trauma. Chapter 1. The prodromal sign she ignored. The day presented as a controlled environment, a state of manufactured normalcy. The subject's attire was impeccable, the employment contract newly finalized. A position sought for 2 years was secured with a remuneration increase of 100%. The new office was a 20-minute commute. Holding her portfolio, she navigated the city, exhibiting a conviction that her fragmented life was stabilizing. Her initial communication was with Lorenzo, her primary attachment figure since age 12. He functioned as the repository for her entire personal history, a deeply ingrained, compulsive ritual. Certain behavioral patterns are resistant to change. This particular ritual had never presented a perceived threat. He responded after 2 rings, meeting her established expectation. "I secured the position," she reported, foregoing social preliminaries. "The contract was signed yesterday. The firm is Viscari Holdings." A silence of 3 cardiac cycles ensued. The line's static seemed to amplify. She was familiar with her brother's nonverbal cues. This was an indicator of distress. "Viscari," he repeated, the name articulated as a threat signifier. "Viscari Holdings." "That is correct," she affirmed, experiencing an involuntary somatic response. "Are you familiar with them?" His reply was delivered with quiet lethality. "I am familiar with its proprietor." His vocal tone shifted immediately, adopting a frequency Lorenzo reserved for imminent threats. It lacked alarmist qualities, presenting instead the detached certainty of a risk analyst predicting a negative outcome. "Inform me," she commanded, and he complied. He engaged in strategic information control, a fact she would only later recognize, providing data sufficient to deter but not to overwhelm. It was adequate. Dante Viscari, age 35, operated an enterprise that rendered his CEO title a functional misnomer. His influence was not contractual. It manifested in anecdotal evidence and the sudden removal of obstacles. He was a revered figure within Mafia circles. His behavioral patterns indicated a preference for ephemeral encounters, reportedly never remaining with the same woman for more than a single night. "Alessia," Lorenzo began, his tone a cautious probe of her psychological defenses. "An individual of that archetype will notice you. Their type always does." Her response was laughter, not hostile, but a dismissive gesture conditioned by 15 years of her brother's perceived hypervigilance. He was the sibling who had forbidden bicycle use at 13 and forecasted disorientation on the subway at 18. His threat assessment was chronically elevated. "Lorenzo," she stated with practiced patience, "my role is executive assistant. I will manage his schedule and documents." His reply was a calm, potent counterargument. "You will enter his private office every single day." "I will perform my duties," she insisted. "A boundary exists." "For you, it does." "For him?" That boundary may be non-existent. A pause followed. Her silence stemmed not from assurance, but from the clinical precision in his voice, which resonated with a truth she actively resisted. This was not melodrama. It was a diagnosis. "You are inducing fear of a man I haven't met," she conceded. "I am providing armament," he corrected, allowing the statement to register. "He does not engage in flirtation, ally. It is an unnecessary tool. He weaponizes his presence. You will feel its effect before you can name it, at which point the outcome is determined." She experienced a desire to dismiss the warning, to assert her status as a capable adult. She made the attempt, her voice betraying a lack of genuine confidence. "This is not about attraction," Lorenzo interjected. "It concerns his method of operation. Your interest is irrelevant to his effect. The two concepts are not linked." Silence resumed. Environmental stimuli intensified as her physiological stress indicators became apparent. "Promise you will call if anything seems anomalous," he requested. His vocalization was purely protective, devoid of judgment. She inhaled deeply, then verbalized her cognitive state. "I promise there will be no anomalies to perceive." It was a statement of profound ignorance, not arrogance. Her next call was to Sophia, who responded with celebration. She compartmentalized Lorenzo's warning, suppressing the data to focus on the perceived new opportunity. The assessment of a new beginning was correct. Her prognosis for its nature was fatally flawed. 10 floors above, Dante Viscari briefly examined her file. It was a procedural act. He closed it without reaching the end. He then remained stationary, observing the city. Marco, his ranking subordinate, would later report this as a rare moment of inscrutability in his superior. Chapter 2. The Initial Contact. The Viscari Tower was an architectural assertion of dominance. The receptionist verified her credentials, issued her security pass, and hesitated. "Good luck," the woman offered, a formulaic smile failing to mask her detachment. Alessia interpreted the two words as a warning. The 10th floor was characterized by an oppressive stillness, an environment of enforced silence. Other assistants observed her, their gazes suggesting speculation on her tenure. She knocked, entered, and ceased all motion. Dante Viscari did not look up. Though his pen was still, she perceived his cognitive focus was on her. He was aware of her presence. This was not preoccupation, but a deliberate exercise in establishing dominance. He was conditioning her to the room's psychological weight. She remained by the door for 45 seconds, her anger rising as she identified the tactic. The interval was sufficient to process the sensory data of power. Then, he raised his head with slow deliberation. His gaze met hers. This was not a managerial assessment. This was a collector identifying a new acquisition for close examination. A deep-seated, instinctual response was activated within her. Lorenzo's words surfaced. "An individual of that archetype will notice you." She corrected her posture, forming an immediate resolution. She would display no weakness. Her defense would be absolute professionalism. "Romano," he said. His voice was a precisely controlled instrument. "Yes," she responded. "Sit." The utterance was not a request, but a command. The command was absolute, stripped of social protocols. The power dynamic was palpable in his posture and the intensity of his gaze. She complied, initiating a series of grounding rituals, opening her laptop, arranging her file, clicking her pen. She then met his gaze, a subtle challenge. He remained motionless, using silence to erode her composure. "You have reviewed your duties," he said. It was a statement of fact, not an inquiry. It was a declaration. "I have," she confirmed, "and I prepared a preliminary plan." He interrupted her. "Unnecessary," he stated. "I determine what is important." He looked down, a clear act of dismissal. For a moment, she held his gaze in a minor act of defiance before activating her computer. The terms of engagement were set, defined by his feigned indifference to a conflict he had already calculated he would win. The morning passed as she adapted to the office rhythm. At 11 o'clock, he spoke her name without looking up, and she instantly provided the file. He reviewed it, the silence extending just past a normal duration. Acceptable. Then she perceived it. His gaze shifted to her, a direct, unprofessional appraisal before returning to the page. He made no attempt to conceal the act. Lorenzo's assessment was validated. The more critical realization, long suppressed, was that her observation had been reciprocal. Chapter 3. The Oppressive Environment. For the first 2 months, they engaged in a covert psychological conflict she had entered unknowingly. It began with the initial appraisal, the first command, and the unrecorded meetings with unidentified men. The facade of Dante Viscari, CEO, began to degrade. The name Srokin appeared on a document left on her desk. The name was unfamiliar, but Marco's swift retrieval of the paper, coupled with a look of alarm, confirmed its significance as a threat indicator. In response, she developed a behavioral doctrine: professionalism as defense, competence as a weapon, and excellence as a shield. Survival required this adaptation upon realizing the office was a staging ground for a deadlier reality. Amid covert discussions, she constructed a sphere of absolute competence. Reports were delivered preemptively, and she resolved issues others avoided. It was an assertion of her own agency, not a bid for his approval. His standards were absolute, reflecting a world view where success is synonymous with survival. Any lapse was met with cold, objective critique. For superior output, however, his acknowledgement was a profound, evaluative stillness. His perception was absolute, an almost physical pressure. A conventionally demanding superior would have been a surmountable professional obstacle. The primary threat vector was his stare, the methodical, unnervingly focused manner in which it deconstructed her every action. He was an initiator, not a reactor. His analysis mirrored her own, dissolving the construct of a standard professional hierarchy. Within her first month, an accumulation of minor data points began to weave a restraint system, ensnaring her before the danger was consciously identified. The process began with the coffee, a fixed daily protocol, small, black, without sugar. This procedure served as the initial conditioning gambit. A coffee materialized one Monday, isolated in the break area. Her name was inscribed on it in his severe, rigid handwriting. She allowed her gaze to remain fixed on the object for a protracted moment until Carla, from accounting, provided a coded whisper, "Welcome to the club." The subject posed no inquiries, simply acquiring the cup. The nonverbal exchange between them was total. Yet each subsequent morning, the offering was present, a triviality, easily rationalized, yet from such seeds, pathological dependencies grow. The green dress constituted the second marker, a form of psychological armor she would adopt for high-stress encounters. It dominated any environment it occupied. She selected it on a Thursday, 2 months into her employment, requiring its symbolic power for a critical presentation. Dante nullified the 11 o'clock meeting without cause. He remained isolated in his office, yet his observation of her throughout the day was altered. subtly, but with a new density, as if the psychic weight of his focus had been deliberately amplified. The clinical reality was evident in the way his gaze would hold hers, a fraction beyond professional decorum. It was present in the nearly imperceptible delay after he vocalized her name, an empty space with no logical function. It manifested as a palpable charge in the air across his desk. She avoided wearing the green dress the following week. 2 more elapsed before she could process the cause. The third marker shattered her defenses. At that second month's conclusion, a dinner was held with the firm's partners. Her role was to be flawlessly, invisibly competent. The event was an exercise in control until a partner, approximately 50 and heavily intoxicated, directed a crude remark toward her. The exact verbiage was lost, but the aggressive intent was clear. By morning, Dante had severed the firm's association with him. The official communication, authored by Marco, cited long-term strategic divergences, a transparent corporate fiction. And Marco Vitali, the perpetual third-party observer, allowed a brief, incisive smile to form. Marco's diagnostic gaze was a silent, continuous variable. He neither concealed it nor deployed it aggressively. She learned of the terminated contract via a forwarded email. She remained immobile before the screen for a considerable time, seized by a novel and chaotic emotional state, a fusion of somatic heat and a profound primal fear. She provided Lorenzo with a carefully redacted summary of the incident that evening. "Are you okay?" was his query. "I'm fine," she falsified. The unfiltered data was reserved for Sophia, who supplied no judgment, no palliative statements. Sophia's protocol was to listen, analyze, and then present the unvarnished, objective facts. By the third month, the office environment itself had transformed. It was a palatable change in the quiet after 5, a tangible current when he moved past, a new weight in his vocal tone. An internal system now constantly triangulated his position. A primitive awareness alerted her when he stood, when he approached, when he lingered by her desk for a second more than required. It was embedded in his pronunciation of her surname, Romano. From his lips, it became a different signifier entirely. It was never a neutral summons. His enunciation of her name was a calculated boundary violation, the move of a subject who has already determined the game's final outcome. Her sole defense mechanism was feigned ignorance. Then, a standard Wednesday afternoon mutated. She was organizing documents at the conference table. The workday was concluding, the area filled with the tense quiet that arises after a mass departure. In the diminishing light, as the building's ambient noise ceased, her attention was on a flawed report. Then she registered the acoustic cue, the sound of Dante's door. She had committed the sound of his gate to memory, its cadence, its pressure, the deliberate rhythm. Her subconscious had been cataloging the data. His trajectory was toward the bookshelf directly behind her position. The room was vast. He had countless available paths, yet he selected the one that encroached upon her personal space. She can retrieve the memory with total clarity, his hand making contact with her back. The barest pressure, a trace of fingertips against her hip for no more than 2 seconds. It was deniable as accidental, save for the micro pause in his stride. A fractional stop before he proceeded. The act was intentional. A nonverbal assertion was made. She remained frozen, the point of contact on her skin, now a somatic marker, an imprint that would persist. Abruptly, he was at the room's far side, examining a folder as if no event had occurred. His composure was absolute, his large frame and controlled movements betraying nothing. The silence between them was now charged with implicit data. She completed her task with slow, methodical motions, aware that any sudden action might disrupt the precarious equilibrium. She gathered her effects, her bag, and exited without a backward glance. The one action she could not permit. The sensation of the touch remained, a phantom heat she carried to the restaurant. With Sophia, the verbal dam finally broke. "He touched me," she stated. Sophia placed her glass down with a sudden, sharp report. "Where?" "On my back." As he passed, Alicia lifted her glass with premeditated slowness. "Alicia," Sophia began, her voice modulated with the specific tone reserved for difficult objective truths. "That man commits no action by chance." She was, of course, already aware of this. The insight had arrived in that flash of clarity that always manifests at the least opportune moment. Yet Sophia's words gave the knowledge a dreadful gravity. "What was the subsequent event?" Sophia pressed. "Nothing occurred," she replied. "He is my superior." Sophia merely observed her, a silent torrent of unsaid analysis in her eyes. For the moment, Sophia finally conceded, signaling the waiter. Chapter 4. A High-Risk Exchange. By month 5, the integrity of Dante's professional persona began to degrade. There was no concrete proof, no single act she could cite, only a certainty that resided at a cellular level. She had become too proficient in his nonverbal dialect to continue her denial. It escalated in the elevator. They entered it together on a Thursday, the air dense, following a protracted meeting. They were alone. He depressed the button for the ground floor, the doors sealed, and the available oxygen seemed to instantly deplete. She fixed her vision on the reflective steel doors as her only defense. He had positioned himself behind her, his olfactory signature registered first. A compound of wood smoke, amber, and an unidentifiable element she had previously indexed. Her fixed stare was a desperate plea for stasis, but a part of her anticipated the impending boundary test. 3 floors remained. He reduced the distance between them, a single centimeter. In the oppressive silence of the enclosure, 1 centimeter was sufficient to erase the professional demarcation. "That dress is a conscious signal," he said. His voice was a low-frequency vibration against her back before the sound fully formed. It was presented as a statement of fact. It was the assessment of an individual who has mapped all potential responses and already knows the conclusion. She did not pivot, her vocalization perfectly stable. "I wear what I choose. I am aware," he responded, allowing a pause to weaponize the silence. "That is the fundamental issue." The doors slid open. She exited with the urgency of someone late for a vital meeting. She was beyond his field of vision before she finally permitted herself to inhale, a volume of air held in check since the 3rd floor. He delayed for 2 complete seconds before following. She did not witness it, but she sensed it. Just as she could perpetually detect his proximity, she knew he remained motionless, and she understood the significance of those 2 seconds. Their travel to Milan was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The itinerary was severe. The logistics she had coordinated were perfect, and their accommodations were separate, though on the same level. The relief this last detail induced was instantly negated by self-recrimination. It confirmed she had considered an alternative scenario, a thought she had suppressed. Day 1 was a marathon of procedural details. In one meeting, she identified a flaw in a partner's data before he did and offered a correction. A sudden quiet settled over the conference. Dante turned toward her. His mouth was a taut line, but his eyes transmitted a signal she automatically stored for later analysis. That evening found her in the hotel bar, her laptop active, with the stated intention of working for another 2 hours. A simple dress, hair unstyled, a glass of wine to mark a minor success. Then he appeared. He took the seat adjacent to hers, deliberately not the one opposite. His arm was millimeters from her own, his proximity a near physical warmth that always preceded him. "The work is concluded," he stated. "I know," she said, and the laptop was closed. Just like that, without resistance or question, an act of submission that disturbed her. She refused to analyze it, because to analyze was to retreat, and her impulse was to remain. That was the core, undeniable fact. They occupied the bar for 90 minutes. His verbalizations were minimal but authentic, worlds removed from sterile corporate discourse. He spoke of his childhood in Milan, a brief, seemingly spontaneous disclosure. She archived every syllable with a level of focus she had spent months attempting to repress. As she prepared to depart, his hand covered hers. The motion was deliberate, unhurried, and devoid of any performative aspect. She looked down at his hand over hers, its firm pressure not an instruction, but a confirmation of a new reality. This was a pressure exerted by pure volition, devoid of physical force. Her hand remained perfectly inert. "You are an anomaly," he stated. The declaration was a clinical diagnosis, stripped of sentiment or artifice, presented as an empirical conclusion. "A standard line for all subjects," she countered, her gaze fixed on his hand. "I do not address all subjects," he replied, and she accepted this as fact. Unequivocally, a somatic certainty that precedes cognitive processing, requiring no validation. She believed it. This very conviction was the source of her profound terror. Within the perceived safety of her room, her cardiac rhythm produced a frantic signal she refused to interpret. A call to her associate, Sophia, was met with a vocalization of such high frequency she recoiled. Her friend's counsel was concise, a single sanctioned deviation. One night, a behavioral exception without lasting implication. The persona of the exemplary assistant would be restored by morning. This night was an outlier to be seized. Post-communication, she remained supine, staring at the ceiling for 40 minutes. The following day, both presented as flawless constructs, navigating their duties as if the preceding night were a shared dissociative episode. Yet the memory persisted, a silent variable that permanently altered the chemistry between them. Late that afternoon, with professional obligations concluded, he passed the threshold where she was organizing documents. His words were a command delivered in passing. "Dinner, 8 o'clock. A significant client. Your attendance is required." She complied. This was a component of her duties, she rationalized. The location was a discreet, low-stimulus establishment where cuisine is considered an art form. She was punctual, arriving at precisely 8. He was unaccompanied. "The client?" she inquired, surveying the environment. Dante's facial expression was a neutral mask that paradoxically revealed the entire artifice, a last-minute cancellation. She became immobilized, her focus locked on him, the table meticulously set for 2, and the wine already decanted. This was a fabricated scenario, she stated, her tone flat. He inclined his head, an affirmation more potent than any verbal confirmation. "You could have informed me," she said. "And you would have declined to attend," he countered. A valid hypothesis, she conceded, assuming her seat. The meal evolved into a genuine discourse, fluid and without defenses, absent of technological distractions. It was a seamless extension of their rapport from the bar. He selected the wine without consulting a list, a disquieting indicator of his accurate assessment of her preferences. A dry remark concerning their Milanese contact elicited an authentic laugh, and he observed her with an expression she could not classify, though its impact registered as a tangible, profound pressure. Mid-meal, his hand moved toward her face, unhurried, his thumb tracing a line so subtle across her cheek she questioned its reality. But the residual warmth was empirical data. "You possess a smile," he observed, his voice lowered to an intimate register designed for somatic reception, "that you conceal in a professional context." She could not formulate a response. She was physiologically inhibited. The moment remains a persistent, intrusive memory. His hand then traversed down her neck, his fingers charting a deliberate path to her shoulder. From its point of contact, the thermal energy of his palm through her attire was a solid, irrefutable stimulus. She expended all available willpower to maintain a neutral expression, though she suspected he could perceive her cognitive state regardless. "Dante," she articulated. Her own voice registered as foreign, denser, more fragile. He responded, his hand maintaining its position. "You are engineering this entire interaction." "Yes," he affirmed with absolute certainty. "I am." The candor of this admission dismantled her psychological defenses. This was not a strategic maneuver. This was a subject who had discarded all pretense. He retracted his hand with torturous slowness, and she dedicated the remainder of the dinner to regulating her respiration. In the vehicle afterward, the ensuing silence between them was a new phenomenon, charged and sentient. Both subjects recognized the trajectory, and neither engaged in denial. In that loaded stillness, an unplanned, visceral intimacy formed. As the vehicle halts before the hotel, he remains motionless, a shape in the low light. My observation is met by his and the subject's infamous control, that formidable defense mechanism. A fracture appears in the facade. For a brief interval, I perceived the individual behind the persona, not the ruthless Don, not the detached CEO, merely the man. I exit the vehicle. He follows me directly to his suite. As I prepare to terminate the encounter, his hand secures my wrist. He reorients me toward him and seizes my mouth. There was, I can attest, a complete absence of tenderness. It was a comprehensive occupation, containing the compressed tension of the preceding 5 months. It represented the climax of every prolonged gaze, every near contact of our hands. It was the sound of all the silences that had resonated between us. His mouth on mine was a key configured for a single specific lock. My motor control faltered. My hands clenched his suit, seeking stability. He simply intensified the kiss, framing my face, his thumb on my jaw, providing a grounding stimulus as if the external world had suspended its function. No space remained between our bodies. He forced the door open and pulled me across the threshold. I offered no resistance. The suite was expansive and dimly lit, with the lights of Milan arrayed beyond the glass. I paused, captivated by the floor-to-ceiling window. He slammed the door. We observed our reflections in the pane, his form closing in on mine, his eyes connecting with my reflection before his hand made contact with the small of my back. It was an image I knew would become a permanent neurological imprint. "Alessia," he said. The first instance, not Romano. "Alessia," spoken in a tone that reconfigured my entire reality. His lips were at my temple, his exhalation a tangible warmth on my skin. "If you wish to leave." "I do not wish to leave," I replied. And that was the final rational thought I processed that night. It must be understood that the Dante Viscari in that suite was not the detached superior or the imposing figure in the suit. He was an individual observing me as if discovering a priceless artifact he had not known he was searching for. He made contact with the same unnerving intensity he applies to all things. This time, however, it was combined with an unfamiliar warmth so anomalous it was exponentially more hazardous than his standard cold-blooded state. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. It required several days for me to fully process the causal chain of events. Not the physical interaction in Milan. That, to my distress, remained painfully vivid. The primary cognitive dissonance lay in observing the subsequent chain reaction, in recognizing how each event was a component of a pre-existing design. I was the first to wake. Milan was a dark panorama, a constellation of remote lights beyond the window. I remained still, absorbing the consequences of our decision. Dante was on his side, one arm extended toward the space I had vacated. Far less the dawn, far more the man. I exited the bed, retrieved my dress, and retreated to the bathroom. Upon my return, he was awake, propped on an elbow, observing me with a focus undiminished by sleep. Fleeing, he diagnosed. His voice was a low, rough-textured sound, deeper than baseline, and it contained a humorous note that disarmed me completely. "I need to retrieve my belongings," I stated. "My flight is scheduled for 3 o'clock. "I am cognizant of the flight time," he replied. "It is 8 in the morning." He then rose, closed the distance between us, and kissed me with the slow, assured heat of a man under no time constraint. One hand held my face, the other at my waist. The kiss continued, systematically dismantling every logical argument for me to withdraw and resume my role as his ideal assistant. Later, at a traditional bistro, Dante revealed a facet of his personality I had never observed, an easygoing demeanor that seemed entirely incongruous for a corporate predator. His inquiries were directed at me, the individual, not the professional function I performed. When I mentioned a meeting, an authentic laugh emerged, a sound I had registered perhaps twice in 5 months. Each instance induced a peculiar and destabilizing current within me. At the airport and on the aircraft, we reverted to our professional personas, though his arm made contact with mine with a pressure so slight as to be deniable, yet firm enough to be intentional. When the car stopped at my residence, he also exited. He observed me unlock the gate, and when I turned to end the evening, he had eliminated the space where verbal communication might have occurred. The second kiss was softer, more concise, his palm resting on my cheek for a single significant beat before he departed. He withdrew, his voice that low frequency I now recognized intimately. "I will see you tomorrow, Romano." Then he receded into the night. I entered my apartment, still holding my coat, and stood immobilized in the entryway for a protracted moment. An alien sensation manifested in my chest, unidentifiable but warm, and it propelled me into a buoyant sleep I hadn't experienced in years. I was not aware I was bidding farewell to that iteration of him. The next morning, I entered the office to find Dante already present, a figure in a dark suit, coffee positioned, documents aligned, his posture rigid, his expression a void, his eyes fixated on the page, an exact replica of day one. It was as if the last 5 months, Milan, the kiss on my sidewalk, the entire sequence had been erased from the timeline. His gaze rose as I neared, scanning me with that familiar, hierarchical appraisal, now completely devoid of the warmth it had contained just days prior. "Romano, last week's report contains a miscalculation in the third quarter projection." Nothing further. His tone was level, without inflection, offering no indication that our dynamic was anything other than employer and employee. I stood there for 2 seconds, the longest of my life, as my sense of equilibrium seemed to disintegrate. I proceeded to my workstation, seated myself, and activated my laptop. "The error will be rectified by 1100 hours," I stated. "By 1000, he countered, his focus already returned to his documents. The exchange was terminated. I operated for the remainder of the day in an automated state, my body executing tasks while my psyche processed the silent psychological assault. I corrected the data, managed his itinerary, and processed his correspondence with clinical precision. He did not acknowledge my departure at 1900 hours. Inside a restaurant lavatory before meeting Sophia, I conducted a 5-minute self-assessment in the mirror, attempting to verify my psychological integrity. The results were inconclusive. I was an incidental variable in his overall narrative, I reported, settling into the chair opposite her. "Alicia," she began, her tone a low frequency. "No," I interjected, my grip on the glass creating blanching on my knuckles, terminating the conversational thread. "It was a single event. It is concluded. I am proceeding forward." Sophia's expression conveyed a complete, unspoken analysis on the merits of pressing the issue. She opted against it. She replenished her wine, remained until midnight, and never referenced the asset's name again. A quiet demonstration of allegiance. I moved on, or rather, I initiated the protocol for doing so. A perimeter of emotional ice formed around me, not from volition, but from necessity. It was a psychic surgery to excise a feeling I had not solicited. Our communications became strictly functional, purged of the pregnant silences and the intense focus I had unconsciously directed toward him. Dante registered the atmospheric shift instantly. I would observe him pausing mid-statement, his gaze executing a brief, analytical scan of my face before he resumed, his own expression a cipher I no longer attempted to decode. My hypothesis was that he was indifferent. This was a catastrophic misdiagnosis. I was not aware that the event had not been a singular occurrence for him either. It was he who was now staring at the ceiling, psychologically unmoored, doing what individuals of his archetype always do. He constructed a fortress, and while we both waited, a transformation was taking root within me, making any pretense of neutrality impossible. Chapter 6. Lorenzo later determined the onset of the sickness occurred in the 6th week post-Milan. I had convinced myself it was merely stress, the perfect scapegoat for my body's sudden systemic failure. I attributed it to a new coffee varietal. I attributed it to the crushing pressure of a project that demanded nocturnal hours. I maintained a running list of rationalizations for days, yet the profound physiological wrongness persisted. On a Tuesday, I procured a test from a pharmacy 2 blocks from my office and administered it in the restroom during my lunch break. I sat in the stall, gripping a piece of tissue for no logical reason, as 2 minutes dilated into an eternity, holding the weight of a clinical verdict. 2 positive indicators. Panic failed to manifest. The personality construct known as Alicia Romano does not permit panic. It was a foundational tenet of my character, and it held firm even in that sterile corporate environment. I observed the 2 lines, my mind in a state of cognitive buffering, attempting to reconcile the visual data with my established reality. I then concealed the test in my handbag, washed my hands, and met my own gaze in the mirror. The subject looking back was superficially unchanged. The immaculate blazer, the rigid posture, the controlled expression. but I detected a minute flicker of disturbance in her eyes. It was the formation of a hurricane that would, in time, make landfall. Regardless of the outcome, egress was imperative. With my bag on my shoulder, my mind was already operating in crisis management mode. Then, as if summoned by the crisis itself, Lorenzo materialized at my apartment door, unannounced, a pattern from our developmental years. He was holding a food container with practiced normalcy. My brother is aware that I cease nutritional intake under duress. "I have heated this for you," he announced, moving past me as if he were the leaseholder. "You neglect to eat when you are disturbed." I remained fixed to the sofa, laptop open, and recited my 3 standard falsehoods. "I am fine. Do not be concerned. I have already eaten." Lorenzo maintained direct eye contact for a full 30 seconds in absolute silence. We possess a form of sibling telepathy. He can interpret my tells with greater accuracy than I can myself. After 3 decades, words are often superfluous. A complete narrative can be discerned in the way an individual holds a plastic container. His gaze communicated it all. "I am aware your life is in a state of chaos, so cease the pretense." He finally inquired, "What is it?" And I retorted, "It is nothing, Lorenzo. I am fine." He set the food down, sat beside me, and gently removed the laptop from my lap. He did not require force. My brother simply clears obstacles before the inevitable eruption of truth. Silence is his most effective instrument. He would not depart until he had the complete intelligence report. And so I provided it. The debriefing was not orderly. The words emerged in a chaotic data stream, articulating the full anatomy of the disaster. The night in Milan, the coffee at the airport, the kiss at the curb, the subsequent Cold War at the office, and the falsified third-quarter report. I documented the months of his calculated emotional withdrawal, which I had miscategorized as disinterest. And then, the conclusion. The restroom on Tuesday. The 2 indicators on the plastic diagnostic tool. When I concluded, Lorenzo became perfectly still. It is a stillness I recognize intimately. It is not serenity. It is the containment of immense destructive energy. It is the posture of a man preparing for action, but affording me the courtesy of completing my testimony first. He stood, moved to the window, and observed the street below. Then he delivered the critical blow. "I warned you." Just 2 words, yet they were not an accusation. There was no victory in his tone, only the profound pain of a man who wished his prognosis had been incorrect. He spoke it softly with his back to me, as if under a great burden. "I know," was my only possible response. "This man," he began, but I cut his sentence short. "Lorenzo." My voice was sharp, a clear signal. I made a choice as well. Do not dare classify me as a victim in this scenario. He turned, and his eyes contained a storm of anger, of hurt, and of a third element I could not yet identify. It presented as guilt, a guilt that seemed entirely misplaced in the context, a burden he carried that he was not yet prepared to disclose. He returned to the sofa and placed his arm around me in the classic Lorenzo embrace, the one reserved for moments when verbal communication is insufficient. The very fact that he was speechless was itself a complete communication. We remained in that position for some time, my head on his shoulder, his arm a solid mass as the city hummed outside, oblivious to the fact that our world was about to undergo a violent collapse. "What is your course of action?" he asked after a period of time. His vocal tone had shifted. It was softer, a brother's inquiry, not a command. "I am still developing a plan," I murmured. He nodded, silent again, before posing the one question of significance. Are you going to inform him? No, I replied instantly with zero hesitation. That decision had finalized on Tuesday. Lorenzo's jaw muscles tightened. He did not contest it. Not at that moment. I understand my brother. He was merely placing a tactical pin in that conflict for a later date. We stayed there for another 2 hours. He arranged the food, handing me a fork with an unspoken directive in his gaze. We ate in a silence that felt appropriate and complete. Following a disclosure of that scale, words lose their utility. When he departed, he drew me into an embrace at the door, maintaining the hold for a moment longer than protocol dictates. Some deep instinct flagged the gesture as a farewell, not a permanent one, but the type given before an individual takes an action they know you would never authorize. Then the door latched, leaving me in the profound isolation of the room. I was unaware of the approaching cataclysm. The reality of the situation would not impact me until long after the damage was irreversible. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. My brother was en route to perform the action I could not, to deliver a truth to Dante Viscari that no one else would venture to speak. And I was ignorant, my reality confined to the laptop's glow as I attempted to construct a letter of resignation. Across the city, Lorenzo was in motion, targeting the Viscari Holdings tower with no appointment, no authorization, and with no intent of showing deference. The report reached me in fragments. A summary from Marco weeks later, then the complete, unedited version from Lorenzo, who took ownership of every second. He had approached reception, stating urgent personal business. He pronounced his surname with an inherent authority that elicits compliance, and it was effective. Upstairs, the name Romano produced a visceral reaction in Marco Vital, who granted him passage. Dante sanctioned the meeting for a single reason. A public disturbance in his 5-star lobby was unacceptable. It was a calculated, unemotional decision. A profound silence occupied the office as Lorenzo entered. Dante was waiting, already standing. Marco witnessed him rise the moment the name Romano was announced over the intercom, a subject preparing for impact. Lorenzo, however, entered the space entirely unaffected. The high-value suit, the dominant cityscape, the gaze that had fractured lesser individuals. These stimuli were meaningless to him. His conditioning had instilled a simple rule: never permit another man's projected aura to diminish your own. The engagement commenced with Lorenzo identifying himself. Dante's reply was a quiet, cold acknowledgement, the placid surface of a violent current. Declining the offered chair was an unambiguous statement of defiance. In response, Dante remained rooted to his position, his body a study in contained energy, his stare a tangible force. Then, the calculated disclosure, an air existed. The words met a wall of perfect silence. Dante's emotional regulation remained absolute. His disquieting calm was not indifference. It was the active suppression of a seismic internal event. Lorenzo continued his psychological assault, refusing any attempt to reframe the situation as a logistical problem. He intercepted every deflection, redirecting the focus to the human subject at the center by speaking her name, Alicia. He then presented a graphic depiction of her private suffering: the sleep deprivation, the inability to retain nutrition, the progressive erosion of her spirit. She carries this burden alone, while your function is what? Executing contracts? Gazing upon the cityscape? Anticipating the problem will self-resolve? You fail to comprehend the variables. I comprehend subjects like you entirely. Lorenzo allowed the diagnosis to saturate the atmosphere before delivering his final incisive blow. You project a clinical persona of absolute control over the enterprise, the outcomes, the personnel. Yet when genuine accountability is required, you retreat. You revert to the detached executive, operating under the delusion that reality will conform to your will, and Dante remained static, absorbing the data stream in complete silence. This was not the silence of a subject calculating a response. It was the vacuum resulting from a profound psychic injury administered by an individual with no inhibiting factors. From the threshold, Lorenzo delivered his terminal, precisely timed stimulus. She processed it as a single event, he stated obliquely, averting his gaze, that she was merely another variable. A temporal space dilated. If that is the accurate data, verbalize it. I will assume the function you have abdicated. We sense Lorenzo is poised to disclose all assets, the transmissions, the escalating liability, the designation. He affixed to every collection instrument, a designation he processed far too late. He suppresses the vocalization. He exits, deploying a conversational explosive device with a trigger mechanism only he can operate. Dante is left in isolation within the office. 120 seconds later, Marco materializes, as if on a programmed schedule, a specialist in silent post-crisis environmental management. He assesses the scene, emitting no data. Dante stood at the window, his designated zone for processing cognitive dissonance. The city below, a system that could provide scale or magnify the void. "Exit," he ordered, and Marco dematerialized. For the first time in years, Dante Viscari was confined with the unprocessed reality of his own psychological architecture. The statements of a man with no fear response had cornered him, presenting facts devoid of the palliative of a softer narrative. You operate as if you own all assets, but when a debt is called, you abscond. He replayed the memory of Alicia in Milan, the morning he deployed his superior persona, unable to manifest as the individual she had engaged with. To be that person meant confronting their shared action, which meant admitting he had no protocol for what followed. And experiencing a state of uncertainty was the one emotional condition Dante Viscari had engineered his life to circumvent, utilizing a self-regulation he had misidentified as power. He reviewed the preceding months, observing her methodical withdrawal, the way Elysia ceased extending her work periods, how her verbalizations became clipped and her gaze cooled, erecting a meticulously engineered distance between them. He classified it as her choice, a boundary he was obligated to respect, the type of barrier a subject without the correct verbal keys can never breach. If you anticipate her approach, you will wait indefinitely. He already possessed this data. He felt it viscerally long before Lorenzo stated it, the familiar pathology of a destructive behavioral loop re-engaging. The subject exhibited paralysis, trapped by a self-constructed schism and awaiting external intervention. His environment, immaculate attire, a fortified office, served as a compensatory control mechanism. After a prolonged period of stasis, a cognitive shift occurred. He resolved not to initiate contact, but to dismantle his primary defense, denial. He would cease feigning control over an affective state that had proven both persistent and ungovernable. It had never subsided. This condition had endured for months. He anticipated Elysia Romano's arrival with a certainty derived from a deeply internalized model of her psychology. Her assumption that she was there to terminate their arrangement was a profound miscalculation. Case File 8, compliance is not optional. My own intent was withdrawal. He preempted my statement by revealing the pregnancy. His subsequent words induced acute psychological disorientation. For 3 days, that letter, a document of cold editorial precision, lay in my bag, rendered inert. It provided 2 weeks' notice, per the contractual stipulation. For the rationale, I entered personal, intentionally vague, as I owed no one a disclosure I would not commit to a formal document. The letter was a study in polite, concise finality. Composing it was simple. Entering his office was the high-difficulty task. I postponed it for 3 days, fabricating justifications, searching for an open interval in his schedule, attempting to generate the fortitude to face him, without my facial expressions betraying my internal state. For 3 days I ascended to the 10th floor, letter prepared, and descended with it, concealed, a complete and total failure of nerve. On Monday I awoke, with the acute, chilling awareness that it must be executed now before my resolve fractured again. I arrived at the office at my standard time, greeted Carla, and prepared coffee. It was the same impeccable blend from the daily provision, a routine I maintained to preempt the inquiries that would arise from its cessation. In truth, I was evading the act of providing an explanation. I stood in the corridor with the cup, focused on his door, and took a final, unstable breath. Dante was positioned by the window, oriented away, his shoulders broad within a perfect dark suit. But an element in his posture arrested me. He was not merely observing the skyline, it was the stance of a subject anticipating an event, someone conscious of my presence, but electing not to turn, applying his standard psychological control over the space. "May I have a moment?" I inquired. He rotated, his gaze locked with mine for a long, charged second. I had catalogued all of his expressions, but this one was novel in its intensity. It was not the gaze of a superior, nor the one from Milan. It was a look I had never before observed, and that unfamiliarity was terrifying, because I was certain I had learned every variant. I presented the letter, my hands compressing it, as if to establish control over the moment, and stated, "I am resigning. 2 weeks, as contracted." The ensuing quiet was a tangible entity. Dante did not move to take the document. His focus remained fixed on me. He stood motionless, his eyes locked with mine, and his voice became devoid of warmth. "The reason, Romano, personal." His tone did not modulate, but it acquired a sharp edge that severed all professional constructs. This was another dynamic entirely, a motive. I had no obligation to provide one. "You're pregnant." The silence that followed his declaration persisted for a full 6 seconds. My mind indexed each second while my body processed the systemic shock. I neither confirmed nor denied his statement. I simply stood there holding the letter as those moments registered like impacts. My entire reality had been inverted, a truth I recognized with a coldness that preceded any emotional response. "How did you know?" The question was a filament of sound, the only coherent thought I could formulate. His silence was the only confirmation required. "Lorenzo." The name surfaced with the sickening clarity of a trusted signature on a document of betrayal. That embrace, it had been a termination ritual laden with all that was not verbalized. With Lorenzo's departure, I had been so disoriented by my own internal crisis that I had been blind to the actual operative forces. Dante began to advance toward me. His velocity was controlled but heavy with purpose, each step an assertion of certainty, not an inquiry. It was the gait of a man who already knew the conflict's resolution. He halted directly before me, collapsing the established boundaries of professional distance. The space between us was eliminated, and my entire nervous system flared in response to his proximity. I raised my chin. The letter remained in my hand, the single object in the universe I still controlled. I no longer wish to be in this location, I said, my voice sharpened by pure volition. Your life is your own, as is mine. Dante was silent, his gaze fixed on me, not the document, not my resignation, me. He observed me with a raw intensity I knew to be his most authentic self, the core exposed only when his formidable restraint mechanisms finally failed. Then he spoke, deploying each word with deliberate, chilling weight. Whether you consent or not, you are staying. I opened my mouth to object. That child is mine. 4 words. 4 words delivered in a low, definitive tone that was neither a command nor a request. It was a statement of immutable fact, a certainty that required no validation. It was the voice of a subject who had already architected the future and was now merely articulating the new parameters of reality. I met his gaze, and he sustained it. In his eyes was a man I had never seen, not my employer, not the subject from Milan, not the cold barrier he had constructed. This was something more primary, something that predated all of that. It was the unguarded Dante Viscari, the man I had observed once previously and never expected to see again. The paper in my hand felt simultaneously irrelevant and incredibly dense. Irrelevant because the reality for which it was intended had ceased to exist. Dense because I still held it, unable to release it. You can't simply, I began. I am not being simply anything, he interrupted, his words sharp with the brutal candor that was his particular form of honesty. I am stating a fact. A fact, I challenged, my voice fracturing against my will, and in that instant, a fissure in his defenses manifested, a stress fracture produced by immense, prolonged pressure. She confronted him. You disappeared. You classified me as mere staff. And now? He cut her off. I am aware of my actions. 5 words. No rationalization, no defense, just a barren admission. She pressed her lips into a tight line, her throat constricting, struggling to conceal her reaction. This does not resolve the situation, she articulated. No, he conceded, but it is our point of origin. The space between them was saturated with the residue of Milan the morning after, and 6 continuous months of a silence neither party could breach. The subject had breached a fragile, unspoken protocol, a cessation of hostilities whose parameters were only now being clinically defined. The unwritten contract manifested in the void between her oppositional behavior and his fixed observation. The letter, an artifact from a prior life phase, was held in her hand. The male subject, Dante, glanced at the object before his focus returned to her, total and unbroken. He exerted no physical pressure, made no verbal demand. He remained, a force of pure inertia, and waited. This anomalous display of patience was more psychologically disruptive than his established patterns of coercion had ever been. Her autonomy was a construct, assembled methodically. The letter, a residence a 20-minute drive away, a self-architected existence. She was cognizant of these assets, yet remained immobilized by his steady gaze. This was not a capitulation to his dominance, nor a repression of past traumas. She remained because his pronouncement, "This offspring is mine," was a statement of such finality her somatic response preceded cognitive processing. And because for the first time Dante Viscari had permitted a lapse in his carefully maintained pragmatic facade. Chapter 9. The Acquisition. The event transpired during a period of oppressive routine, a temporal condition often preceding the resolution of long-standing conflicts. In the weeks following the confrontation, she remained, rationalizing her stasis with the conflicted logic of a mind in distress. Her presence was dictated by his refusal to grant her departure, a condition distinct from a desire to stay and far removed from acknowledging the letter's symbolic obsolescence. Their dynamic achieved a tense, precarious homeostasis balanced between unverbalized data and the resonance of his claim. The arrival of Lorenzo that Thursday served as a precursor to a significant destabilizing event. His presentation was markedly degraded from his baseline. His affable expression was a fragile facsimile. Periorbital hyperpigmentation indicated severe fatigue. The disarray of his attire, a minor but atypical detail, signaled a profound internal decompensation. The warning signs had been present for weeks: covert communications, fiscal obfuscation, and a provisional domicile he had occupied for 3 months. She had engaged in willful ignorance, a choice now generating remorse. The liabilities, she stated, bypassing his performative composure. Has the situation deteriorated? The matter is managed, he retorted, the defensive quality in his voice fracturing his affect. His gaze shifted evasively before re-engaging hers. She maintained eye contact. Lorenzo, provide a precise account of the circumstances. This is not your burden to assume. His tone was severe, a significant deviation from his disposition. However, you must exercise extreme caution. Do you understand? Observe everything. In transit with others, maintain a heightened state of awareness. Your behavior is inducing anxiety. I am being prudent. He produced an expression she associated with life or death imperatives. Commit to being vigilant. She consented, sensing the gravity without knowing the stimulus. A subsequent cognitive reconstruction of events, when the violent, scattered data points aligned, would show he was already overwhelmed. He had received the initial warnings, the untenable conditions, and then a photograph of her, captured covertly as she exited her workplace. Below, a clinical caption. We understand her value to both of you. He suppressed this information, internalizing the terror in a misguided attempt to shield her. Her medical appointment was routine. The vehicle waiting at the clinic was a precise duplicate of Dante's, identical model, same color, and the very license plate she had memorized. Such an exact replication is never stochastic. It is the product of meticulous preparation informed by insider intelligence. It requires significant resources, capital, and flawless execution. The driver's gesture appeared normative as she approached. He opened the door, verbalizing her name with practiced fluency. She entered. In that instant, however, a cognitive dissonance occurred. The olfactory input was incorrect. It lacked the familiar scent of leather and the specific fragrance Dante's chauffeur utilized. The upholstery's texture felt discrepant, a subtle detail others would overlook. She initiated speech, but the moment had passed. The action was swift, sterile, executed with the cold awareness that perfection is invisible, while deviations attract notice. They had neutralized Dante's primary strategic asset, his capacity for rapid response. She regained consciousness, restrained in a chair. The environment was confined, the air stagnant. A diffuse, artificial light induced temporal disorientation. Her hands were bound posteriorly with proficient knots, a sign of her captor's expertise. Confronted with an overwhelming threat, her mind defaulted to an analytical mode. She began a count. 3 individuals were visible. Others moved beyond the door. She listened, creating a mental schematic of the room. No windows, one externally secured door. The climate was controlled. This was a professional operation. Her focus then locked onto the child she carried, a final inviolable anchor. She executed one controlled inhalation, then a second. A soothing ritual developed through a lifetime of turmoil. Her thoughts focused on Dante, not with the hope of salvation, but with the cold logic of one who understood his fundamental psychology. This child is my property. An individual who articulates those words with such force does not cede what he has claimed. This was not faith, it was tactical assessment. It brought her a sense of equilibrium. At 2:00 in the afternoon, a second image illuminated Lorenzo's phone. It showed her bound to a chair, alive, unharmed but undeniably captive. Beneath the photograph was a stark, singular instruction. You know who possesses our capital. Go to him, now. We are monitoring all movement. And so, Lorenzo ran. He moved rapidly through the city, the phone in his hand, its screen a searing emblem of his failure. He entered Viscari Holdings, exhibiting respiratory distress like a subject buckling under an extreme load. Marco observed the acute terror in his eyes and, disregarding protocol, led him directly upstairs. Dante was at the window when Lorenzo entered. When he turned, the agony on the brother's face induced a somatic rigidity Marco had rarely observed. "Report," Dante commanded. And the complete, damaging truth was disclosed. He confessed everything. The coercive tactics, the escalating threats, the debt that had become unmanageable, and the sickening realization that Victor Srokin was the primary operator. He admitted to the first photograph of her, concealed for weeks out of a hubristic belief that he alone could resolve the situation. Then he spoke of the new image. "I never conceived they would use her as an asset," Lorenzo rasped, his vocal control finally failing. "I swear this contingency was not anticipated." Dante remained completely motionless. Lorenzo would later identify that stillness as the most oppressive weight he had ever known. It was not anger, it was the absolute containment of a man restraining a cataclysmic response. Then the telephone on his desk rang. The number was concealed. Dante seized the receiver before it completed its initial ring, his action swift and deliberate. He anticipated the caller. The voice on the line was saturated with a cold, rehearsed calm, an affect engineered as a weapon. "Dante Viscari," a strategic pause. "I presume you are now apprised of the girl's change in residence." Dante's silence was sufficient affirmation. Lorenzo Romano was the ideal instrument, Victor stated, his tone flat with the satisfaction of a successful plan. "His debt was our vector, his sister our leverage, and you," another calculated beat, "were always the objective." Dante angled his head toward the window, his profile like carved stone. "The conditions are simple," Victor continued. "You will surrender the disputed property, you will cede access, you will assume all of Romano's debt, comply, and she will be returned." The demand was untenable, not for its monetary value, but for the capitulation of power it signified. It was a solicitation for absolute defeat, something Dante would never consider under any other circumstance. Except this one. "You have 2 hours," Victor advised, "after which the acquisition cost increases, and I can no longer guarantee her condition or that of the child." The line disconnected. The silence that permeated the office held a novel quality of dread Marco had never before experienced. It was not rage. It was its precursor, something more fundamental, more primal. It was the psychic fracture of a man whose life was built on legacy protection, now confronting a catastrophic failure. Lorenzo stood, his complexion ashen, finally comprehending the devastating scale of his error. "Dante," he whispered, his voice fragmented. "I was not aware." "Acknowledged," Dante replied, his own voice low and sharp, yet devoid of blame. He was already in motion, his plan formulated in the instant Victor mistakenly believed he had 2 hours to negotiate. Marco would forever describe the next 2 hours with the sparse vocabulary of someone who had witnessed an event that could not be spoken of. Dante yielded no territory, refusing to sign any document. He activated 3 covert contacts Marco would not dare to name and whose identities were never solicited. In under 40 minutes, he possessed the warehouse location, a census of the men inside, and verification that Victor was a freelance operator acting without syndicate sanction. The threat was a fragile construct. Dante, a specialist in deconstructing such facades, dismantled the entire operation well before Victor's 2-hour deadline passed. Reports from the action arrived in fragments. No shots were fired. Dante's operatives moved in a silent, 3-pronged maneuver. A communication from Victor's actual principal reportedly occurred mid-assault, forcing an abrupt withdrawal just before Dante's team made contact. Following that, complete silence ensued. An abrupt cessation of environmental sound registered with the subject. The familiar auditory baseline, shuffling movements, muted voices, the strain of wood, vanished, creating a vacuum. This new silence was not an absence, but a dense, hyper-vigilant state, suggesting a disorganized retreat. An external event had occurred, its nature, deliverance or termination, unknown, inducing acute psychological distress. The subject initiated self-soothing protocols, regulating respiration and focusing on her gravid state, a biological anchor utilized to maintain stability and execute the primary directive. Survival. Temporal perception distorted, extending seconds into minutes before the door was breached. The male subject, Dante, entered first, his posture rigid within a dark suit. His typical gait, a rhythm that provided a regulating effect on her, was pathologically altered. It was now a rapid, precise, tactical advance, the physical manifestation of a rehearsed mental schematic. In under 2 seconds, his visual scan of the perimeter was complete, terminating as he acquired her location and established direct eye contact. Her initial assessment of his facial expression registered not relief, but cognitive dissonance, the observable lag of a psyche reconciling a catastrophic expectation with a benign reality. Her, viable. Her, intact. Her hand on her abdomen, her gaze defiant despite her restraints, a consistent display of oppositional behavior. He crossed the intervening space and assumed a kneeling posture, a symbolic shift in power dynamics that preemptively dismantled her emotional defenses. His manipulation of the ropes was efficient. The knots yielded as if to a pre-programmed command. The moment physical restraints were removed, he initiated tactile contact, cupping her hands without pressure. The contact transmitted warmth, a form of sensory input to counteract shock. A swift, methodical scan of her body followed, a clinical search for the physical injuries his mind had manufactured during the preceding hours. He was purging cognitive phantoms. "You're all right," he stated, the words functioning as a self-administered affirmation. "I am," she confirmed. His hand met her face, his thumb a brief point of contact as their gazes reconnected. In his eyes, she observed a degree of vulnerability not previously documented. This presentation was inconsistent with his established personas. The Don, the detached Milan associate. The psychological fortress he maintained had been reduced to rubble. This was the core subject, stripped of defense mechanisms, his psyche abraded by hours of acute stress that rendered artifice unsustainable. The moment was fleeting. He rose, using his hands to guide her to a standing position. He paused, a final visual confirmation that she was structurally sound. In the vehicle, a profound silence persisted for 2 minutes as she engaged in visual scannings of the exterior. He monitored the road, yet stress indicators remained. Mandibular tension, rigid shoulder posture, and a gripping motion on his own knee. Residual tremors from his internal conflict. "You were afraid," he stated. "A direct probe?" "Yes." "Of what?" She finally redirected her gaze to his profile. He maintained forward focus, but his inquiry was weighted with the need for accurate data. She could have offered safer variables: the squalid environment, the psychological duress of uncertainty. Instead, she chose the authentic stimulus of not seeing you again, she admitted with low vocal volume. The subsequent silence was qualitatively different from the preceding ones. A muscle spasmed in his jaw, the hand on his knee repositioned with deliberate, measured movement covering hers. Contact was maintained for the remainder of the transit to his residence. No further verbal exchange was initiated. This was a fragile truth, one that develops optimally in nonverbal conditions. Both subjects, Dante and Elysia, understood from prior trauma that verbalization can dilute the potency of a core experience. This silent transaction became more than an episodic memory. It formed a new baseline. Her verbal disclosure, an admission that altered the emotional atmosphere, his subsequent stillness, the sustained tactile pressure, these were the foundational elements of their restructured dynamic. The objective of this construction was unknown, only that the process had commenced. Within 3 weeks of her extraction, his domicile became her primary residence. The transition was never negotiated. It was an erosion of her defenses, accelerated by the abduction, her confession, and a moment when the impulse to contact him was met by the acute distress of his absence. She never disclosed this precipitating event. She arrived with one suitcase, its minimal contents eliciting no comment. This was their established communication pattern. Yet a nonverbal lexicon has limitations, which they encountered in the second week. At 3 a.m, she awoke to the negative space on his side of the bed. She located him near a window, his face illuminated by a phone, exhibiting the remote, inaccessible affect of their initial interactions. Her inquiry was met with a clipped "work," a vocal tone that signaled a reinstatement of his previous emotional boundaries. She returned to their room, remaining awake until dawn, assessing the potential for a catastrophic error in judgment. The breaking point manifested as a dispute regarding Lorenzo's rehabilitation, triggered by a financial document she discovered. The confrontation was not about the expenditure, but the concealment. Deception was the specific toxin from their prior relational failures. Its reintroduction required immediate clarification. "I paid for it because it was a necessary intervention," he stated, his tone flat. "You hid it because that is your default behavior," she countered. The ensuing silence was the suffocating variant she would no longer tolerate. After a prolonged interval, he spoke, jaw tension preceding the admission. "I don't yet know how to be different," he conceded. "But I am trying." It was a minimal offering, but it possessed authenticity. She was learning that with Dante, honesty was the only currency with actual value. Lorenzo was in a treatment facility for compulsive gambling. an institution providing the structured discipline required to combat his pathology. He had submitted to treatment voluntarily, a development she was still processing. Lorenzo had historically performed the role of protector, absorbing familial stress with forced congeniality. This new iteration, a subject admitting to being fundamentally broken, was a figure viewed through a complex lens of relief and grief for the destruction that had necessitated this salvation. She attended weekly visitations, her presence a predictable, silent constant. Understanding her brother required routine more than discourse. Dante was financing the entire operation. She found this out incidentally via a statement filed with the clinic's letterhead bearing his signature. She observed the document, registering a slow, internal, somatic response she refused to classify. To name the emotion was to accept it, a level of vulnerability she was not prepared for. She said nothing. He said nothing. This was their shared dialect. Complex concepts transmitted without vocalization, a system that felt at times insufficient and at others complete. He returned one Wednesday to find her on the balcony. Below, the urban landscape was a grid of gold against a bruised crepuscular sky. She was observing the vista, her posture relaxed, the slight convexity of her abdomen now apparent. A profound quiet had descended with the twilight, a state of peace she had almost ceased to recognize. She registered the sound of the door, then his footsteps, an acoustic signature she could now differentiate by intent. She recognized the specific cadence indicating he was seeking her out. He paused in the doorway, his guarded gaze betraying an emotion she could sense but not yet decode. It was the expression of a subject observing an unanticipated variable, a sight compelling a momentary reorganization of his worldview. He stood beside her, their proximity close but not touching. For the first time, the space between them was calm rather than fraught with subtext. This was not the silence of omission, but of shared existence. "Lorenzo called," she reported. "I know. He said he contacted you before this." A pause. "He said you were angry," she added. "I was. That does not invalidate his assessment." Dante turned, his defensive posture dissolving entirely, revealing a rawness she had never before observed. This was not the syndicate leader, the calculated operator, or the commanding executive. This was the base subject, stripped bare by the accuracy of his brother's assessment and still processing the psychological injury. "He has an infuriating capacity for being correct," Dante admitted. A laugh escaped her, sharp and unexpected. He observed her with a familiar expression, the one indicating the moment was being encoded into long-term memory, archiving a sensation for which he had no name. The resulting quiet was not a void. It signaled a resolution. "I was a fool," he said, devoid of the armor used to shield profound regret. With you, following the Milan incident, she identified her own emotional state and promptly erected defenses to manage the psychological fallout. "It was not," she stated. "No," he concurred, "it was not." "You offered no words." "I am aware." His gaze held hers. "I allowed you to believe you were interchangeable. The feeling was terrifying, and I lacked a lexicon for it. I defaulted to my primary coping mechanism for perceived threats." "You construct a wall," she finished. "I construct a wall," he confessed, fully exposed. This was a truth reserved for moments of ultimate consequence. "This does not negate the last few months," she declared. "No," he conceded, "but it is the truth. Your entitlement to it is absolute." He retrieved an item from his pocket. It was a simple object, a plain, dark gold band lacking the ostentation of a typical gemstone. It would later be known as a copy of his mother's ring, his only schema for this act, and its selection had caused him more internal turmoil than any other decision that year. He presented it, but did not kneel. Such a performance would be incongruous with his character, and therefore inauthentic to her. This moment required veracity. "I do not know the correct protocol for this," he said, his voice a low, singular tone that was unrepeatable. "I have no paradigm for intimacy that is not a conflict for control. I don't know how to engage in affection that is not threatening for the other party and for myself." She allowed the silence to persist. "But I have learned a singular fact." His focus sharpened with its familiar intensity. "The only time in my existence I have experienced genuine fear was during your absence. I could not respire. I was uncertain I could reach you in time." "You were counting," she whispered, "every last one." The information did not impact her as a shock. It integrated slowly as the most profound truths do. Dante Viscari, a subject whose entire psychology was founded on control, emotional fortification, and self-reliance, had been enumerating every minute she was gone. He did not force the ring onto her finger. He placed it into her open palm with a slow, deliberate pressure. It was the distinction between a command and an inquiry, between acquisition and choice. "Stay," he stated, "not for the child, not as a directive, but because this is a request." "You abhor asking," she observed. "I do," he confirmed, with an honesty so severe it was nearly comical. "This is the closest I will come to a proposal, is it not?" "For now," he replied, a new humor showing as his defenses fractured. "I imagine you could improve with practice." She laughed, a sound of authentic ease that manifests only in the presence of a true psychological counterpart. He observed her with the expression from the Milan bistro, one she now fully understood. It was the face of a man who had identified the one stimulus he wished to observe for the remainder of his life. She slid the ring onto her own finger. "You will require a great deal of practice," she advised. His hand settled on her stomach, slow and intentional, deploying a tenderness that was still a novel behavior for him. His hand remained a solid warmth over the location of their gestating child, which was oblivious to the parental storm. "We have time," he said. "We have time." Her brother's clinical assessment echoed in her mind. Dangerous, a manipulator, uncontrollable. He was correct on all 3 points. He was incorrect on only one. He presumed these traits would be a deterrent. Instead, they were the foundational elements of her attachment. In selecting him, she was consenting to all the beautiful chaos that would ensue. This is Lena. While that concludes Volume 1, my analysis of Volume 2 is already complete. Access is available for a most modest price. The communication arrived without a sender. Breaking the seal, she anticipated business, another sterile contract. Inside, however, was a covert history, dates, files, communiques, ending with a single handwritten line. The script was alien, yet it held the chilling composure of one about to incite a cataclysm. He was not merely cognizant of your brother's financial ruin, he was its primary architect, having maneuvered Lorenzo into the trap that led to your capture. Ask him why. The paper drifted from her grip. Her gaze traveled from the ring to her own abdomen to the door where Dante stood, unaware that she now held the proof. The man who implored her to stay was the orchestrator of her suffering. What Dante provided was not salvation. He had merely transferred her from a cage of his own design. And for the first time since consenting to his terms, she questioned if this gilded enclosure was ever meant for her. This, as you have likely deduced, is merely an abstract from Book 2. The complete, unedited case file awaits via the hyperlink in the annotated comment. I shall join you there. That initial link connects directly to the second novel. Clear of advertisements or interruptions. The process is simple. I found compiling this next chapter gratifying, and with your ongoing support, more will be forthcoming. On that site, you will discover narratives that examine far more profound and intense psychological territory. This is authentic, dark romance, presented raw and unfiltered. As the material is substantially more adult in nature, I am unable to share it on public YouTube. This private archive allows me to present my full analysis and produce my most potent work for you. As a point of information, this channel is no longer monetized. This project is the exclusive method by which I can support my team and continue creating these high-quality case studies. More information is forthcoming. I will await you there through the first link in the annotated comment. Regrettably, we have contended with numerous instances of unauthorized duplication of our audio, theft of the narrative, and direct reposting on YouTube.
Life lesson, sometimes both sides lose, not because nobody cared, but because everybody waited too long. This is the part that hurts because the script is almost rude in how accurate it is. He is the kind of man who can command empires, erase threats, and probably terrify a room just by adjusting his cufflinks. Incredible, amazing, elite-level menace. But ask him to process one real feeling like an emotionally literate adult, suddenly the man acts like honesty is a federal crime. And she is not naive, that is what makes it sting. She sees the patterns, she feels the shift. She knows something happened, but instead of forcing the truth into daylight, she does what many strong people do. She goes silent, becomes efficient, and starts packing pain into neat little boxes labeled, "I'll deal with it later." Spoiler alert, later always sends interest. That is why this story works as more than drama. It drags viewers toward a life lesson nobody enjoys admitting. A lot of suffering is not created by hatred, it is created by delay. Delayed honesty, delayed apology, delayed vulnerability, delayed action. Everybody in the story keeps waiting for the perfect emotional timing, and life, being extremely disrespectful, keeps moving anyway. The brother waits to reveal how serious the danger is. She waits to resign. He waits to admit what she means to him. Everybody waits, and then boom, pregnancy, kidnapping, collapse, confession. Classic cinema. Emotional property damage everywhere. But the nastiest truth is this: both of them were starving in the same room for the same thing, reassurance. He wanted proof he was not just losing control, she wanted proof she was not just another episode in his history. Neither said it plainly, so each one suffered the other's silence as rejection. That is the real kill shot. People often interpret fear in others as lack of love, when in reality it may be love without language. That does not excuse the damage, not at all, but it explains why the aftermath feels tragic instead of simple. So the life lesson lands hard and clean. If something matters, say it before pride turns it into a funeral. Because once pain starts narrating the story, it becomes a terrible screenwriter. It gives every silence the worst meaning, and by the time the truth finally shows up, the characters are no longer deciding between happiness and heartbreak. They are deciding how much heartbreak can still be saved.